Imagine for a second that you are the White House press secretary. You know, you're one of the most visible, highly connected government officials on the planet, right?
Oh, absolutely. High profile.
Right. And you pull out your phone, you open a social media app, and you try to send a private direct message to just one single person, like a private digital whisper.
Just a standard DM.
Exactly.
No.
You hit send and the message fails. And it's not because you don't have cell service or whatever. It's because the platform's underlying infrastructure has actively intercepted your private communication.
Wow.
Yeah. It analyzed the link you were trying to share and literally decided that you are not allowed to send it. And then your account just gets locked.
I mean, it's the digital equivalent of a mail carrier. You know, opening your sealed envelope, reading the letter inside, deciding they don't like what it says, and then refusing to deliver it, while putting a padlock on your mailbox at the same time.
Right. And that is not some dystopian hypothetical. According to the source material we are examining today, that is exactly what happened to Kayleigh McEnany in October of 2020.
Yeah, which is just wild.
It really is. And it's just one incredibly granular piece of a much, much larger puzzle. So welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we're looking at the life cycle of a modern political controversy.
We want to know what actually happens behind the scenes, you know, when a piece of explosive information hits this heavily polarized, digitally connected world we live in.
Exactly. Like, where are the fail-safes? Who is actually manning the switches? And how does a single data dump just cascade into a crisis of geopolitical proportions?
So to unpack all of this, we're looking at a very specific, highly explosive case study today. Our source material is drawn directly from a transcript of a YouTube interview on the Rubin Report.
Right, hosted by Dave Rubin.
Yeah, and he's interviewing the journalist Miranda Devine. She's a prominent columnist for the New York Post. And their discussion, it centers heavily on her direct involvement in breaking the infamous Hunter Biden laptop story.
Yeah.
And then the unprecedented media and tech fallout that followed, and how that entire saga sort of maps onto our current heavily fractured media and geopolitical landscape.
Now, before we go a single step further, I really need to make something absolutely unequivocally clear to you, the listener. We are about to wade into some incredibly deep, muddy waters here.
Very muddy.
Yeah. The source material we're examining today contains highly polarized, politically charged claims. And these claims, they span across the actions of both left-wing and right-wing figures, traditional government agencies, and, massive multinational tech corporations.
It is a veritable minefield of modern political friction.
It really is. So here is our crucial neutrality disclaimer for you. In this deep dive, we are operating as completely impartial analysts. We are not taking sides.
At all.
Right. We're not validating, we're not endorsing, and we are certainly not trying to prove or disprove the viewpoints of the original speakers in this YouTube transcript.
Our mission, our only mission today, is to meticulously map out the arguments, the claims, and the specific narratives presented in the text.
We want to understand the underlying mechanics of this broader ecosystem exactly as it's described by the source. We're here to look at the architectural blueprint they've laid out, not to build the house or, argue about the paint color.
Right. We're essentially acting as neutral cartographers.
Yeah.
We've been handed a map drawn by a specific person, charting a specific perspective, and we're just analyzing what that map tells us about the terrain.
The incredibly rugged terrain of our modern information war. So, keeping that map in mind, let's trace this entire narrative back to its physical origin.
Let's do it.
Because before there were congressional hearings and before there were intelligence community letters and algorithmic blackouts, there was literally just a physical object sitting in a rather mundane location.
Yeah, the origin point. According to the timeline laid out in our source, it's a computer repair shop in Delaware. It's April of 2019.
Okay, Delaware, 2019.
Right. The shop is owned by a man named John Paul McIsaac, and the source states that a customer, who was identified as Hunter Biden, dropped off a water-damaged laptop for data recovery. And then, crucially, he just never returned to pick it up or pay the bill.
And the timeline here is really the first major domino, isn't it? The text notes this drop-off occurred just a couple of weeks before Joe Biden officially announced he was running for president.
Right, the timing is wild.
So the laptop just sits there.
Yeah.
And eventually, the legal parameters of abandoned property kick in. That gives Isaac ownership of the physical hardware and, by extension, access to the data. So he makes clones.
Like exact digital bit-for-bit copies of the hard drive.
Exactly. And then we fast forward. We move from that quiet repair shop in 2019 to the absolute fever pitch of the fall of 2020, We are now mere weeks before the presidential election.
The stakes couldn't be higher.
Right. And a copy of this hard drive clone has somehow made its tortuous way to Rudy Giuliani.
Who at the time was the personal lawyer for then-President Donald Trump.
Yeah, and Giuliani's lawyer, Bob Costello. So they have this drive. They know it contains a massive amount of highly sensitive data. And according to the narrative, they start shopping it around to journalists.
Right, trying to get it published.
But the reaction they get is incredibly telling about the state of modern journalism. I mean, you would think every reporter in Washington would be trampling over each other to get an exclusive look at the inner workings of a presidential candidate's family.
Oh, totally. A career-making scoop.
But the source says outlets were actually extremely reluctant. They viewed it as, quote, too hot to handle.
And too hot to handle is such a fascinating phrase to unpack in this context. Like, why would an industry built on scoops reject the ultimate scoop?
Right. What?
Well, because the provenance of the data is incredibly messy. It's coming directly from the political opponent's lawyer 3 weeks before an election.
Yeah, that's a red flag for any editor.
Exactly. The political implications are seismic, and perhaps most importantly, the sheer staggering volume of the data is just overwhelming.
Okay, let's talk about the mechanics of that for a second, because this is basically a radioactive hot potato. Imagine you're a senior editor at a major newspaper. Someone drops a physical brick of data on your desk.
Just gigabytes of it.
Yeah, it's not a neatly typed, highly redacted government memo. It's a human life, digitally frozen. Emails, text messages, photos, financial documents. It is chaotic.
Utter chaos.
So in the modern fast-paced news cycle, how does an editorial team actually verify a massive, messy, dumped cache of digital data in just a few days without making catastrophic errors?
Because if you get it wrong...
Exactly. If you rush this and publish forged documents in the final weeks of an election, you don't just lose a news cycle, you destroy your publication's institutional credibility forever.
It is an editorial tightrope walk over an active volcano. And that brings us to Miranda Devine in the New York Post.
Right.
The source details how Devine, who had recently written a piece favorable to Giuliani, essentially became their final option. Giuliani and Costello were allegedly preparing to take the drive to a British tabloid out of pure frustration.
Wow, they were going to take it overseas.
Yeah. But Devine takes it to her editor, Colin Allen, and they make this monumental decision to just activate the entire newsroom to tackle this massive data dump.
But they immediately hit a massive editorial roadblock. The text describes the contents of the hard drive as a complete disaster. It was filled with what Devine explicitly calls a whole layer of smut and porn and filth.
Right.
We're talking about videos and photos of illicit drug use, explicit encounters. I mean, it was essentially the digital diary of a man in the depths of severe, unrestrained addiction.
And here is where we really see the critical, foundational concept of editorial triage in action.
How so?
Well, Devine states that she and her editors made a conscious, deliberate, and highly strategic choice to completely bypass all those sensational personal scandals.
They just ignored the tabloidy stuff.
Exactly. They looked at the drug use, they looked at the explicit material, and decided to sideline it entirely. The logic, as is presented in the source, was that many American families deal with the tragedy of addiction. A son's addiction doesn't necessarily disqualify a father from the presidency.
Which, I mean, is actually a remarkable amount of restraint if you think about the stereotypical incentives of modern media. You have a clickbait goldmine of celebrity scandal handed to you, and you actively choose to ignore it.
Right.
Because their focus was entirely laser-pointed on one specific objective allegations of political corruption.
Precisely. They were digging for evidence that directly contradicted Joe Biden's public, repeated claims on the campaign trail.
Right, because during the campaign, Joe Biden was emphatically stating that he knew absolutely nothing about his son's overseas business dealings, that he had never spoken to him about it.
Right. So the journalistic mission, as framed by Devine in this interview, was to intensely examine the business communications. The New York Post newsroom focused on parsing through these complex emails, detailing millions of dollars allegedly flowing from entities in China, Ukraine, and Russia.
And the Post found emails that strongly suggested Joe Biden had, in fact, met with his son's foreign business partners while he was serving as vice president.
Yeah. And, it's worth noting how they utilized that discarded layer of smut we mentioned.
Oh, right, the photo.
Yeah. According to the source, they only published a single photograph from that immense cache of personal material. It was a photo initially described as Hunter with a crack pipe, which they later corrected to a meth pipe.
But they didn't publish it to shame him for drug use, did they?
No, not at all. They used it purely as proof of life.
Basically a proof of authenticity.
Exactly. It was a visual anchor. You know, in a world where emails can be spoofed or documents forged pretty easily, a highly personal, previously unseen photograph serves as a verifiable anchor to say, yes, this is undeniably his laptop. We have the real deal.
That makes sense. If we look at the underlying logic here, this editorial triage matters profoundly.
It really does.
By meticulously discarding the sensational personal scandals, the journalists at the Post were attempting to force a highly specific, substantive conversation. They wanted a debate on policy, on ethics, on foreign influence.
They were setting up a direct, targeted clash with the political establishment's core narrative.
Right. They weren't just throwing mud at the wall to see what stuck. They were aiming a very specific, carefully constructed arrow at the primary defense of a presidential candidate.
So they do the exhausting work, they verify what they can within that compressed time frame, they write the copy, they set the layout, and they hit publish.
The New York Post, the oldest continuously published daily newspaper in the United States, founded by Alexander Hamilton, no less, drops a massive front-page bombshell.
Boom.
And normally, traditionally, that is the end of the journalistic pipeline. You print the paper, the trucks deliver it, people buy it, the cable news networks pick it up, and the great American debate happens.
But
this is the 21st century. Printing a story doesn't mean anyone is actually allowed to read it.
Right, because the infrastructural response to this publication was unlike anything we had ever witnessed in the history of American media.
So let's get into the digital bouncers. The source describes an immediate, unprecedented, and highly coordinated blackout. Within hours of the story going live on the New York Post's website, Twitter and Facebook didn't just ignore the story. They actively deployed their underlying architecture to suppress it.
Let's break down the technical realities of what the source describes here, because it's important. Facebook opted for algorithmic throttling.
What does that mean in practice?
It means they didn't delete the link entirely, but they adjusted the back-end weights of their distribution algorithm to drastically reduce the article's virality coefficient.
So it just wouldn't spread.
Right. If you posted it, it wouldn't show up in your friends' feeds. They effectively shadow banned a major news investigation.
But Twitter went entirely nuclear.
Oh, completely.
They didn't just throttle it, they instituted a hard URL block. You literally could not paste the link into a tweet and hit send. The platform's code just prohibited the dissemination of that specific text string.
And we really need to emphasize the terrifying granularity of this censorship. Going back to the scenario you opened the show with about Kayleigh McEnany.
Right, the private DM.
The platform's infrastructure didn't just patrol the public square. It actively reached into a private one-on-one digital exchange and blocked it, and then locked the account of a sitting White House official.
And it wasn't just her. The New York Post's official Twitter account was locked too. A major American newspaper was essentially deplatformed for over 2 weeks. They were only unlocked a couple of days before the actual election.
Which is just staggering.
And the source points out that this kind of draconian action against the fourth largest newspaper by circulation in the country was entirely unheard of. But ironically, it elevated the story, didn't it?
Oh, it absolutely Streisand affected it. It transformed it from a standard political scandal into a massive, overarching, existential censorship scandal.
Right. So the immediate question, of course, is who was pulling these massive digital levers? At first glance, it looked like a bunch of Silicon Valley tech executives making panicked, isolated decisions in a boardroom.
But the source material reveals a much deeper, vastly darker layer of coordination. It wasn't just Silicon Valley acting on its own volition. It was the FBI.
Wait, the FBI? According to the transcript, the FBI had been in physical possession of the laptop since December of 2019. They had a subpoena, they took the hardware from McIsaac's shop, they knew its contents.
They presumably knew it was real?
Yeah. And yet, in the weeks leading up to the election, they held repeated high-level meetings with major tech companies. The source claims the FBI was actively pre-bunking the story.
Pre-bunking. It is a vital concept to understand in modern information warfare.
Let's unpack it, because it sounds like something out of a psychological thriller. The claim is that the FBI warned these platforms to be on high, specific alert for a Russian hack and leak operation in October, and they specifically seeded the idea that this operation would involve Hunter Biden.
They planted the idea that whatever was coming down the pipeline was foreign disinformation before it even arrived.
And the source mentions that Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, later admitted to this exact dynamic on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Yeah, he did. He confirmed that the FBI's stern warnings directly influenced Facebook's algorithmic decision to suppress the story when it finally broke.
Okay, I have to jump in here and play devil's advocate for you, the listener. Let's look at the historical context of 2020.
Sure.
The entire intelligence and tech apparatus in the United States was deeply, profoundly traumatized by the events of the 2016 election. The prevailing consensus was that Russian actors had successfully weaponized social media to sow chaos.
True.
So, is it entirely possible that this pre-bunking was a genuine, albeit deeply flawed and catastrophic attempt to protect the election infrastructure from what they honestly believed was a repeat attack? Or does the source frame it entirely as a cynical, hyper-partisan political cover-up?
That is the pivotal analytical question.
Yeah.
The source, Miranda Devine, unequivocally frames it as a partisan cover-up.
Okay.
She explicitly argues it was not done for legitimate national security reasons, but specifically to provide cover for Joe Biden's campaign. However, your quote highlights the brilliant, insidious psychological mechanics at play here. Pre-bunking is rooted in inoculation theory.
Inoculation theory.
Yeah. If you tell someone a lie is coming before they hear it, their cognitive defenses are fully activated. So when the information eventually arrives, even if it is 100% true, it triggers the pre-programmed "this is a lie" response.
Wow. It's hacking human psychology before you even write a line of code to hack the algorithm. You're programming the tech executive's brain so that when the New York Post publishes, the executives reflexively pull the plug.
Exactly. And the text goes even further into the architecture of this coordination, citing the Twitter file.
Right, the internal documents released after Elon Musk purchased Twitter.
Right. According to the source, these files, which were analyzed by independent journalists, allegedly uncovered a vast integrated network of former FBI and CIA operatives who had literally taken jobs working within the trust and safety departments of these big tech platforms.
Wow.
The source frames this not as a coincidence, but as a planted cell of intelligence operatives positioned to control information flows and ensure a specific electoral outcome.
The implications of how this was executed are just staggering. What we are seeing described in the source is the effective outsourcing of the First Amendment.
Absolutely.
The United States government cannot legally tell a newspaper what to print or tell citizens what they can read. That is fundamentally unconstitutional. But if domestic law enforcement can quietly, informally suggest to a tech oligarch that a story is a dangerous foreign plot.
And then the tech oligarch flips a private corporate switch that effectively erases the story.
Exactly. The government has achieved massive censorship by proxy.
It is a massive, gaping loophole in the architecture of free speech. The digital bouncers aren't just checking IDs at the door anymore. They are dictating what conversations you are legally allowed to have inside the club. And they're doing it based on quiet, deniable suggestions from the police parked across the street.
But the suppression didn't stop at the digital borders. It wasn't just algorithms and locked social media accounts. The censorship moved from the tech servers onto official government letterheads.
Right. The narrative shifts from passive suppression to active, aggressive narrative creation.
And this brings us to the involvement of the traditional intelligence apparatus. Specifically, the origins of the infamous public letters signed by 51 former intelligence officials.
And we really need to stress who these people were.
Right, they weren't nobodies.
No, these weren't low-level analysts or desk jockeys. We are talking about the absolute heavy hitters of the American intelligence community. The text specifically notes that the signatories included 5 former or acting directors of the CIA.
Like John Brennan and Leon Panetta.
Exactly. When 51 people with those kinds of world-shaping resumes sign a public document, the entire media establishment snaps to attention.
But the genesis of the letter, as detailed meticulously by the source, is highly political, not analytical. The claim is that the letter was instigated by Antony Blinken,
who at the time was a senior campaign advisor to Joe Biden. He, of course, later became the Secretary of State.
Right. And the source states Blinken reached out to Mike Morrell, a former acting director of the CIA, and essentially coerced or motivated the creation of this letter. Morrell then leveraged his incredible network to gather 50 of his former colleagues to sign it.
And we have to look closely at the exact language they used in that letter. What did it actually say? Because it is a masterclass in bureaucratic phrasing.
Yeah, they didn't explicitly say, we have examined the hard drive and we have proof this is fake, because that would be a verifiable lie.
Exactly. Instead, it used very specific, carefully crafted, heavily lawyered language. It claimed the laptop had, quote, all the earmarks of a Russian information operation.
Earmark.
Earmarks. That single word is the ultimate escape hatch.
It provides absolute, ironclad plausible deniability while simultaneously delivering maximum narrative impact. It's an insinuation disguised as an official assessment.
And it worked flawlessly. That phrase allowed outlets like Politico to run with massive headlines declaring that the laptop story was Russian disinformation, which then gave the rest of the legacy media ecosystem the exact runway they needed to entirely ignore the New York Post's reporting.
They successfully laundered a partisan political defense through the unquestioned credibility of the intelligence community. But here is where the story gets incredibly strange, diving into the deep plumbing of Washington bureaucracy.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Yeah. According to the source, House investigations much later revealed how this letter actually navigated the internal hurdles to get cleared for publication. Because these are former intelligence officers dealing with potentially highly classified topics, they can't just hit send on a Google Doc and tweet it out, right?
Right. The institutional protocols still apply, even after you retire. They're legally required to go through a CIA pre-publication review board. The purpose of that board is to ensure no state secrets are spilled.
But the source states the review board looked at this letter and felt it was completely radioactive. It was way above their pay grade and blatantly political, especially dropping just 3 weeks before a presidential election.
So doing what bureaucrats do best, they kicked it upstairs.
They sent it to the CIA's number 3 in command, the chief operating officer, a man named Andrew McCreadis.
And what does he do? He also says it's above his pay grade. He doesn't want his fingerprints on it.
So where does it go? The source claims McCreadis literally walked across the corridor at CIA headquarters in Langley and handed the physical document to Gina Haspel.
And Gina Haspel was, at that exact moment, the director of the CIA.
But wait, let's pause here because this is the detail that completely breaks the traditional partisan narrative. She was Donald Trump's CIA director.
Yeah, she was.
She was appointed to that position by the very president. This letter was explicitly designed to damage. And the source states that Haspel looked at the letter and gave it the green light. She approved it, despite everyone below her flagging it as a hyper-political grenade.
Right.
So I have to ask you, why in the world would Trump's own hand-picked CIA director approve a highly political document that directly undermined a story damaging to Trump's opponent? It makes absolutely zero logical sense if you view Washington purely through a Republican versus Democrat lens.
Which is exactly why this specific detail is so illuminating. It forces us to entirely resynthesize our understanding of power in Washington. It forces us to look at the concept of the deep state.
Okay, unpack that, because that term gets thrown around a lot.
Right. And the source isn't framing the deep state as some shadowy, cartoonish cabal plotting in a smoke-filled room. It is framing it as a sociological reality of massive, entrenched bureaucracies. What the source is illustrating here is that bureaucratic survival, deep institutional alignment, and intensely held personal or ideological animosities. They often completely override explicit partisan loyalty.
Or even the direct authority of the President of the United States.
Exactly. A career intelligence officer or an institution as a whole might view an insurgent, norm-breaking populist president, even the one who appointed them to their current role, as a fundamentally greater threat to the institutional order than the opposing political party.
So the true alignment in Washington, according to this narrative, is not Republican versus Democrat. It is the permanent administrative state versus anyone who threatens its equilibrium.
Right. The source suggests that these agencies had lost their foundational America First bearing and become ideologically skewed, proving entirely willing to intervene in domestic democratic politics to protect their own worldview and preferred outcomes.
It's an institutional immune system response, but the immune system has turned around and started attacking the host body.
Well put.
So let's pull back and look at the battlefield. The laptop is dropped by the Post, the tech companies immediately block the digital exits, and the intelligence community drops a massive rhetorical smoke bomb to confuse the public. What is the ultimate result of all this coordination?
The fallout leads directly into a massive existential crisis of trust in legacy media.
Right. The audience, the American public, watches this heavily coordinated suppression happen in real time. They realize they're being actively managed and they leave. They migrate en masse.
Which brings us to the profound splintering of the media landscape. The source material presents a stark, unforgiving contrast between legacy institutions explicitly naming the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the rapidly rising tide of alternative media.
Miranda Devine's critique of the legacy press in this interview is absolutely scathing. She argues they have been completely, fundamentally compromised.
And she doesn't just make a broad complaint. She lists specific structural vectors of compromise.
What are they?
First, she points to identity politics, saying places like the New York Times have been entirely eaten up by it, prioritizing narrative over objective truth. Second, she echoes a historical point her father made about the Cold War, that the intelligence community actively utilizes spies to infiltrate newsrooms, acting as high-level anonymous sources to skew coverage and align it with state narratives.
Wow. And third?
Third, she points to the very origin of the pipeline: journalism schools. She specifically mentions prestigious institutions like Northwestern's Medill School and Columbia University. Her argument is that these schools no longer teach the grueling nuts and bolts of objective, unbiased reporting.
Instead, they teach young journalists that their primary moral role is to be activists, shaping the world rather than just describing it.
Exactly.
So you have a new generation of activist reporters, guided by high-level intelligence narratives, wrapped in an impenetrable layer of identity politics. That's her brutal diagnosis of legacy media. And this tension, this rot, as she sees it, really comes to a head over the highly contentious issue of anonymous sources.
Yes, and the source makes a very careful distinction here. Devine aggressively defends the use of anonymous sources in her own reporting, specifically regarding the Hunter Biden story.
She argues they are absolutely vital, legally and morally, to protect vulnerable whistleblowers from retaliation. She cites a specific example, right?
She does. She brings up Devin Archer, a former associate and business partner of Hunter Biden. She claims that Archer faced absolute financial ruin and severe legal peril from the establishment for not being sufficiently loyal to the Biden family.
I see.
So in those specific cases, she argues, anonymity is a necessary shield for the truth. It protects the weak from the powerful.
But then she completely flips the script on how legacy media uses that exact same tool. She accuses outlets like the New York Times of using anonymous sources not to protect brave whistleblowers, but merely to launder lies for the powerful.
Right. If the source is a proven liar, and she claims certain intelligence officials or politicians like Adam Schiff have proven to be in friend, and the newspaper prints their claims anonymously without verification.
The paper is essentially loaning its century of institutional credibility to a deliberate falsehood.
Which perfectly logically explains the mass exodus of the audience. If the public slowly realizes that the legacy media is laundering lies for the state apparatus, they will inevitably seek authenticity and raw truth elsewhere.
And the source points to the ultimate manifestation of this monumental shift, the 2024 podcast election.
The podcast election is such a perfect defining term for the era we are living in.
It really is. The source talks about how Donald Trump, recognizing this massive shift, fanned out to shows like Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, and other seemingly obscure, culturally massive podcasts, intentionally bypassing traditional news networks entirely.
Because podcasting offers something legacy TV simply cannot.
Yeah.
Deep, unspun, long-form conversations. It's an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours of just talking without a script.
The audience gets a feel for the real person, beyond the heavily edited 30-second soundbite or the combative performative White House press conference.
It is a massive consumer demand for unmediated access.
Right.
But we have to analyze the profound structural difference between these two worlds.
Let me try an analogy here. The prompt's outline specifically mentions comparing this to a walled garden versus the Wild West.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of legacy media like a walled garden with a dying lawn. You have editors, fact-checkers, lawyers, all these massive walls built to keep the bad information out and cultivate the truth. But the public looks at the lawn and thinks, this grass is dead. You're growing weeds and telling us it's roses. So they jump the wall and run out into alt media, which is the Wild West. There are no walls, there's no sheriff, just individuals with microphones staking their claims. So my question to you is, do the heavy guardrails of the walled garden actually prevent the truth from getting out, or does the total lack of guardrails in the Wild West inevitably invite chaos and conspiracy?
That analogy perfectly captures the defining tension of our modern information age. It highlights the incredibly sharp, double-edged sword of alternative media. As the source heavily points out, alt media offers unparalleled authenticity and speed.
You can bypass the compromised gatekeepers effortlessly.
Exactly. If a vital story like the laptop is suppressed by the walled garden, a podcaster in the Wild West will just broadcast it to millions anyway. But it relies entirely, 100%, on the innate integrity, the humility, the psychological stability, and the raw talent of the individual broadcaster.
Right. In a legacy institution, if a reporter starts chasing a wild conspiracy theory, an editor catches it. A lawyer flags it for libel. There's an institutional safety net designed to create friction.
But in the podcasting world, it's just you, a microphone, and a direct pipeline to millions of people. If the broadcaster gets dizzy and goes off course, there's literally no one sitting next to them to grab the steering wheel.
Which is a terrifying amount of unchecked power for one person with a high-speed internet connection. And the source actually provides us with a granular, deeply personal, and highly revealing look at what happens when someone navigates this exact transition.
They offer a case study of one of the biggest, most controversial stars to ever make the jump from the walled garden to the Wild West.
We are talking about the trajectory of Tucker Carlson.
Right. To perfectly illustrate the dangers and the deep psychological traps of this new media landscape, Devine spends a significant portion of the interview discussing Tucker Carlson.
Which is particularly insightful because Devine notes she was previously close friends with him, right?
Yes. She was even halfway through writing a biography about him when he abruptly left Fox News.
His sudden departure from Fox was a seismic, earth-shattering event in the media world. But Devine points to a very specific, often overlooked structural consequence of that departure. It wasn't just that he lost his primetime slot and the massive Fox audience.
He lost his elite production team. She specifically names his executive producer, Justin Wells, and describes the retinue of behind-the-scenes geniuses who constructed the show.
This ties directly back to your point about institutional friction. Devine argues that you simply don't become the #1 host in cable news for years on end purely on your own. You need an incredible, highly structured team, leveraging that raw talent, editing the impulses, and turning it into gold.
When Carlson went independent, launching his own show on Twitter and setting up his own podcasting network, he lost all of those institutional friction points. He became isolated in his own genius.
And when you are isolated, your underlying psychology becomes the only map you have left to navigate by. The source traces Carlson's current ideological state, which many find baffling, back to a very specific, deeply rooted trauma.
His profound, lasting regret over aggressively supporting the Iraq War in the early 2000s.
Exactly. Devine explains that Carlson felt entirely hoodwinked and deeply betrayed by the establishment neoconservatives. She specifically names Bill Kristol as a figure Carlson felt deceived by.
You have to understand the context here. Neoconservatives heavily promoted the war based on intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be completely false.
Carlson realized he had used his immense talent and charisma to prosecute a war that he later concluded was a disastrous, blood-soaked mistake. He had friends who died there.
That intense trauma birthed a profound, foundational, uncompromising anti-war stance.
It created a deep, permanent, burning suspicion of the intelligence community and the foreign policy establishment, which, given the history, is a totally understandable and rational reaction.
Oh, absolutely. But the source outlines a very dark critique of how that trauma has metastasized in his current independent era. Devine accuses him of extreme hubris. She says that without the Fox News team around him to ground him, he has fallen headfirst into a psychological trap.
She sharply criticizes him for giving massive, uncritical platforms to highly controversial fringe figures, doesn't she?
Yes. She explicitly mentions Holocaust revisionist historians and the white nationalist commentator Nick Fuentes. And she makes a crucial, nuanced journalistic distinction here.
What's the distinction?
She said, sure, you can interview these people. Journalism sometimes requires talking to terrible people.
Yeah.
But you don't treat them as legitimate, credible experts.
Yeah.
You don't interview them passively, as if their fringe claims hold equal weight to established historical fact.
Right.
She implies he is doing this purely for clicks, for the shock value, for the millions of algorithmic views, essentially abandoning his actual brilliance on topics like privacy and civil liberties to lazily chase engagement by platforming the absolute fringe.
Okay, here's my theory on this, and I want you to weigh in and tell me if I'm off base. Is Tucker Carlson's trajectory, as described here, the ultimate textbook cautionary tale of audience capture?
Let's define the mechanics of that.
When a broadcaster removes all institutional friction, no editors, no legal department to say no, and the only feedback loop they have is their own ego and the dopamine hit of internet engagement metrics, do they inevitably spiral into conspiracy?
This is a huge risk.
If your audience heavily rewards you with millions of views and massive ad revenue every single time you attack the establishment, do you eventually run out of legitimate targets? Do you have to start finding crazier and crazier things the establishment hates in order to keep feeding the algorithmic machine?
It is the defining existential vulnerability of independent journalism. What you are describing is a psychological calcification process.
Calcification?
Yeah. Carlson's trajectory, exactly as framed by the source, represents how legitimate skepticism born from real agonizing trauma like the catastrophic lies surrounding the Iraq War, can calcify over time. It hardens into a rigid, inflexible ideology where you start to believe that because the establishment lied to you about one massive thing, everything the establishment hates must therefore be true.
It's a reverse heuristic. If the mainstream media writes an article saying the sky is blue, your immediate, uncontrollable reflex is to invite a guest onto your massive podcast to explain why the sky is actually a holographic projection of green light, just to prove to your audience that you aren't controlled by the mainstream narrative.
Exactly. You become a pure, reactionary reflection of the very thing you despise. You lose your independent compass because your only true north is opposing whatever the establishment says.
Wow.
And when you perfectly couple that psychological trap with the massive financial and ego rewards of algorithmic engagement, the downward spiral into the fringe is almost inevitable. You're alone in the Wild West, steering by following the loudest cheers from the mob.
It's tragic, really, as the source describes it. A brilliant generational talent, isolated and entirely captured by his own digital echo chamber. But I want to pull us back to the macro level, because this isn't just about media gossip or podcasting drama or the tragic flaws of famous broadcasters.
No, the stakes are much higher.
The mechanics we've been discussing for the last hour, the algorithmic censorship, the splintering of reality, the intelligence community interventions, the audience capture, they have terrifying life or death real-world consequences. We are not just debating what files are on a laptop anymore. We are talking about the mechanisms that govern bombs and borders.
Which brings us to the final, sobering reality check. The source material pivots sharply from media critique to the stark, unforgiving realities of global conflict and domestic national security.
We need to set the scene exactly as it is framed in the transcript. The text appears to project a scenario framing a hypothetical or future casting a Trump administration about a year and a half into a term.
Right. The interview is discussing a scenario of an active, highly volatile, ongoing conflict with Iran. The source outlines the administration's incredibly delicate strategy in this scenario.
What's the strategy?
Trump is actively trying to degrade Iranian military and nuclear capabilities using targeted force. But, and this is a huge critical constraint, he is desperately trying to avoid a forever war.
He's trying to thread an almost impossible geopolitical needle, showing overwhelming strength without getting bogged down in another trillion-dollar, decades-long occupation like Iraq or Afghanistan.
And this high-wire geopolitical tightrope is inextricably tied to domestic economic anxieties. The text notes the intense, overarching pressure to keep the Strait of Hormuz open.
Let's trace the mechanics of why that matters so much.
If Iran closes the strait, a massive percentage of the world's oil supply is cut off. The flow of oil instantly dictates the price of gas at the American pump.
And the price of gas feeds directly into the cost of shipping, which feeds into the cost of groceries and the overall cost of living.
Exactly. And the cost of living is the ultimate, undeniable deciding factor in American midterm elections. Global warfare is inexorably linked to domestic political survival. You cannot separate the two.
And as if that economic pressure cooker isn't enough, the domestic blowback highlighted by the source is truly frightening.
It really is.
The text outlines a series of terrifying security threats directly linked to this geopolitical tension. It mentions the terrifying reality of sleeper cells inside the United States. It details a specifically foiled ISIS bomb plot in New York City, where the attackers allegedly stated they wanted the carnage to dwarf the Boston Marathon bombing.
It goes on. It mentions a Pakistani man convicted of an Iranian-backed plot to assassinate Donald Trump, noting this is at least the second major foiled assassination plot directed by the Iranian regime.
And it references a jihadist mass shooting in Austin, Texas, where multiple innocent people were killed. The text explicitly links these rising domestic terror threats to the vulnerabilities created by previous administration border policies.
It is a dark, incredibly tense, multi-front picture of national security. But here is the moment, the specific data point that ties this entire deep dive together into a perfect, terrifying bow.
Lay it out for us.
The source drops a polling statistic regarding how the American public views this exact war scenario with Iran. It states that roughly 80% of Republicans believe the administration is explaining its war strategy well and executing it properly.
80%, okay.
But only 5% of Democrats agree.
Let that sink in. An 80-5 split on a fundamental matter of national survival and global war.
Exactly.
So my question to you is Is this massive canyon-like gap simply a matter of policy disagreement? Do Democrats just inherently hate the tactical strategy being deployed in the Middle East? Or is this 80-5 split the ultimate, undeniable mathematical proof that our media silos have completely succeeded?
That is the big question.
Have we actually created two entirely separate, impenetrable realities for the American public, where we can't even agree on the basic facts of whether a war is being fought effectively or why we are fighting it?
It is the absolute culmination of everything we've discussed today. Look at the chain of events. The exact same mechanical forces that justified suppressing the New York Post laptop story.
The same algorithms that throttled the links and locked private DMs?
The same intelligence apparatus that crafted the 51 official letter using the word earmarks.
And the same algorithmic feedback loops that isolated Tucker Carlson.
Yes, those exact same mechanics are now dictating how American citizens perceive a foreign war and imminent domestic terror threats.
We aren't just reading different opinion columns about the same event anymore. We are receiving completely different data sets. We are being fed different facts.
Precisely. The source explicitly blames this catastrophic division on the public being siloed in our news centers. Devine argues that if you only watch one specific network, she uses MSNBC as her example, you're kept woefully ignorant about half of what's going on in the world.
Right.
When trust in shared foundational institutions completely dies, when the New York Times is viewed by half the country as merely an activist organ for the state, and independent podcasts are viewed by the other half as untethered, dangerous conspiracy engines people don't just disagree on tax policy or healthcare.
They disagree on basic survival facts. They disagree on whether a bomb threat in New York is real or whether a war in the Middle East is succeeding or failing.
It's absolute epistemic closure. We are sealed inside our own digital bubbles, the walls are entirely opaque, and we only hear the echoes of our own fears.
And in a time of hot global war and active domestic terror plots, that lack of shared reality is not just a fascinating philosophical problem for podcasters to discuss. It is a profound, fatal national vulnerability.
Because a divided nation, fundamentally, cannot mount a unified, effective defense if it cannot even agree on the basic nature, origin, and reality of the threat it is facing.
Okay, let's try to pull all of this massive complexity together. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, tracing a singular, highly contentious narrative thread through a chaotic, deeply fractured landscape.
We started with a discarded, water-damaged hard drive sitting in a mundane Delaware repair shop, a messy, radioactive cache of data that possessed the power to upend a presidential election.
We watched the agonizing process of editorial triage in action, seeing journalists make the deliberate choice to bypass pure personal scandal to target structural political corruption.
Then, we witnessed the digital bouncers flex their unprecedented muscles, with massive tech platforms and domestic law enforcement apparently coordinating to throttle the story. An act of censorship completely unprecedented in American history.
We saw the traditional, immensely powerful intelligence community step into the fray, allegedly laundering a political defense through a highly bureaucratic letter signed by 51 experts, which was ultimately greenlit by the very administration it was ironically designed to undermine, proving that institutions protect institutions.
Which logically led to the mass exodus of the public from legacy media, fleeing what they perceived as activist, compromised, state-aligned institutions and running headlong into the exhilarating but highly dangerous Wild West of podcasting and alt media.
Where we examine the tragic, cautionary tale of Tucker Carlson, illustrating how the total loss of institutional guardrails, combined with the lingering trauma of past establishment betrayals, can lead directly to audience capture and the calcification of legitimate skepticism into contrarian extremism.
And finally, we saw how all of this invisible infrastructure, the algorithmic censorship, the media splintering, the psychological siloing, has resulted in a populace so deeply divided that they perceive a hot war and literal domestic terror plots through entirely separate, utterly incompatible realities.
It is a comprehensive, highly detailed, and deeply unsettling map of a fundamentally broken information ecosystem. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought.
One thing to think about.
Yeah, something to really mull over the next time you open your phone and scroll through your feed. Look closely at the invisible architecture we just mapped out together. Think about the sheer, terrifying speed of the digital censorship.
Think about the invisible power of the algorithms shaping your feed.
Think about the willingness of massive bureaucracies to intervene in the truth, and the extreme isolation of the alternative media bubbles that promise to save us.
The complete infrastructure of reality creation.
If another massive world-altering piece of information were to drop tomorrow, another laptop, another massive whistleblower leak, another undeniable explosive truth that fundamentally challenges the core of the establishment, do we currently possess any shared trusted mechanism left in this country to agree on what is true?
Or are we permanently locked into our separate digital realities, fighting a cold war of information where we can never, ever agree on the facts again?
That is, without a doubt, the defining question of our time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep your eyes open, stay intensely curious, and always, always keep questioning the sources you consume. We'll see you next time.